Good evening, everyone. We're excited to have with us this evening on our Racial Healing and Reconciliation Conference call that we have every month from the Jacksonville Urban League Center for Advocacy and Social Justice. I'm Dennis Stone, director of the center. And as I said, we're delighted to have with us Dr. Felicia Bevel from the University of North Florida. She teaches Black history, among other things, at the university, and we're excited to have her here, and along with our one of our interns, Anna Russell, and also uh, the president of the local chapter of the African American History Group. So, with that, Dr. Bevel, please join us.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much again for your patience. I'm very, very sorry for the technical issues, and I really appreciate you staying online with us today. So today I wanted to, well, first I want to thank the Jacksonville Urban League for inviting me to take part in this monthly series. It's an honor to speak with you all and be in conversation with you all this month, especially given that Juneteenth is coming up, and that's a little bit of what I wanted to talk about today. So I wanted to start by having us consider the, oh, great. Okay. I
Just came
wanted to I wanted to start by having us consider the Black History theme that ASALH, or the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, first founded by Carter G. Woodson in 1915, put forth this year. Every year they have a sort of annual Black History themes around labor and creative arts, community building. And this year the theme is uh, Black commemoration, commemorating the past. And I think that that's such a an urgent uh, sort of statement that ASALH is making. And it really allows us to think about the history and legacy of using public space to commemorate the past. But that past has not always been celebrated, and it still is not celebrated in the current political moment. As we, as a nation, are celebrating our 250th anniversary, there is still very much widespread efforts to either erase or distort Black history at the K through 12 level education and even in higher ed. And as a faculty member who teaches Black history, I see that very um, vividly in what I teach and some of the responses to what I teach. And so, with that, I'd like to first start by talking a little bit about how Black folks have commemorated our past across history. And it really starts with emancipation celebrations. And these really started at the beginning of the 19th century, especially in celebration of other emancipation processes that were happening elsewhere, like the Haitian Revolution, for instance. And really, once we began to undergo our own emancipation process here in the United States, following the end of the Civil War and the 13th Amendment, um, we began to really take up public space to celebrate our own emancipation here in the United States. And these took on a number of forms. Usually it was a moment of educating the public about Black history, about our contributions to the nation, about our service to this country through military service. There would often be military parades of Black veterans at these celebrations. And they were really sites of, as other scholars have argued, educating, agitating, and commemorating and coming together as a community. And we see this happen all across the United States. Um, and they usually would commemorate particular moments, moments like the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, moments such as Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865, as I'm sure we all are aware of. And of course, we are coming up on Juneteenth, 2026, in a couple of weeks. And also to celebrate particular figures whom African Americans and people of African descent have seen as central to these emancipation moments. People like Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, um, Harriet Tubman, and others. And this is part of a larger drive by African American and African diasporic communities in the United States to really use public space to present a Black-centered narrative that centers and prioritizes and shows Black citizenship, right? This is a time where African Americans, particularly during Reconstruction and in the post-Reconstruction period, which we can really locate starting roughly 1877 into the 1880s, this is a moment where African Americans are losing what little rights they gained during Reconstruction, where they are unable to hold political office, particularly in parts of the South, where they are facing increasingly stringent segregationist laws, laws that are really become set in stone by the time we get to 1896 and the Supreme Court decision Plessy v. Ferguson, which really makes separate but equal the law of the land, um, up until Brown v. Board in 1954. And so African Americans are really wanting to put forth a narrative that speaks to their contributions and that showcases how much they deserve citizenship rights that should have been guaranteed through the 14th Amendment, but had not been in reality. And so these celebrations were really also part of a response to other sorts of histories that demonized and made fun of African Americans and their contributions. Um, and these contested memories, ones that we can see right here in Jacksonville, have played out in very distinct ways. So I'm sure that you all have been to James Weldon Johnson Park downtown. Um, and this has been a site of contested memory and contested history, right? That it's really important for us to understand that history is not objective, that it's not just about facts and dates and memorizing um, historical events, but it's about interpretation, interpreting evidence. And there have been different interpretations of that evidence that have led to distorted histories. And we can see this, and we actually saw this up until a few years ago, right here in Jacksonville. So, what was formerly known as Hemming Park, which is now James Weldon Johnson Park, in honor of Jacksonville native and civil rights activist James Weldon Johnson, this park used to hold a statue of a kind of generic Confederate soldier. And this was part of a larger drive by white Southerners, but not just white Southerners, but I would say the nation overall, of reconciling from the fractures of the Civil War through this umbrella of a kind of romanticized South, Old South, kind of lost cause narrative. And that statue that used to be in at the park was representative of this drive, a drive that was led by organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy and other white women's societies that took it upon themselves to put forth their version of the past, a version that often either erased African Americans or sort of romanticized African Americans and their enslavement. So that's one version of the past that we used to at least see at the park downtown. The other version of the past that we still see, it's still there, of course, is the historical marker honoring Axe Handle Saturday. And this really is a counter in many ways to the statue that used to be present. Um, and this, yes, you can keep going one more slide. Yes. So this historical marker, if you go back one slide, that you see on the right, this is in honor of the incredibly courageous efforts of Black youth, particularly people like our very own Rodney Hurst and others who were part of the NAACP Youth Council here in Jacksonville, who led a series of sit-in protests downtown, lunch counter sit-ins. And as a result, the demonstrators, as well as um, African American bystanders, were verbally and physically attacked by local white residents who were coming to oppose these demonstrations. And so this is capturing a history of resistance, resistance not just to the violence that African Americans faced, but resistance to the representations that were used to legitimize that violence, representations like this Confederate statue. If you go to the next slide. And part of this racial violence that we see and that we have seen in Jacksonville, particularly, it's not just the kind of physical racial violence that we have seen through the numerous incidents of lynching that happened here in Jacksonville. And on the left here, I just have an image of a panel from a traveling exhibit that was hosted by 90 Forward, as well as the Museum of Science and History, and it also for a time was located at UNF at our library. And this was a museum exhibit that was really educating the public about lynching here in Duval County. And so this is the type of violence that African Americans were experiencing in their everyday lives. And we can see the legacy of that right here in our own backyard. But at the same time, we also have representational violence that was happening through the creation and establishment of Confederate named schools, such as the former Robert E. Lee High School, which you can see on the right, which has now been renamed, along with several other middle and high schools in Jacksonville. But this is the type of representational violence that I'm talking about. That it's not just about the physical lynching and sort of other forms of racial terror, but it's also what ideas are we consuming, what images of the past are we consuming, what histories are we celebrating, are we glorifying? And I would argue, as others have, of course, that naming schools or erecting monuments and statues is a way of glorifying that distorted past. Next slide. But there are ways that here in Jacksonville, African Americans push back against these very damaging narratives. Our very own activists, one who I already mentioned, James Weldon Johnson, who, along with his brother, John Rosamond Johnson, created the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. He, as well as other local activists and leaders like Eartha M. White, really took it upon themselves to organize these commemorations of Black history. And so here I have an example of a Lincoln Douglas um, 50 Years of Freedom commemoration that Eartha White helped organize in 1913. And she did a lot of amazing work in terms of our kind of celebrating Black history throughout her life. And this is just one example of that right here in Jacksonville. And this was a way that Black communities were resisting. They were resisting that physical violence and representational violence that we see not just in Jacksonville, but across the country. Next slide, please. And as I said, this resistance continued, right? This resistance also took the form of civil rights demonstrations. As I mentioned, the historical marker in the park, this is in honor of the bravery of Rodney Hurst, who's pictured here in the center of the photograph, and other students, Black youth at the time, who led this local civil rights lunch counter sit-ins. And as a result, like I said, they did face verbal and physical violence. But this is a really important moment in not just our local history, but our national history that I think should be, could be more recognized and more well known. And so these are the types of contested memories and histories that we see here in Jacksonville. One of sort of distorting the past and glorifying the Confederacy and the lost cause narrative at the expense of African Americans, and on the other side, resistance that we see through the work of Eartha White and James William Johnson, through the work of Rodney Hurst and other civil rights activists in the 50s and 60s. And so when we think about contested histories, we can look no further than Jacksonville, Florida. Next slide, please. So I wanted to very briefly talk a little bit about some of my own research in terms of particular African Americans who, throughout their careers, made it their mission to resist representational violence. Next slide. And one such figure who I research is Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson was a very well-known actor and activist who probably one of his most well-known performances was his role in the musical turned film Showboat, which I have a photograph from the Schoenberg Center in New York on the left-hand side of the screen. But as he was acting in these roles that, some of these roles, like the one in Showboat, that did sort of romanticize the South in these particular ways, he still used his artistry as a platform of protest, that he understood that representation could be damaging, right? That the images and ideas about Black people that we consume and that circulate have a very lasting impact on their lived experiences. And so he was very well known throughout his career, both domestic, at the domestic and internationally, of promoting anti-fascist, anti-colonial, and anti-capitalist in some ways uh, stance. He was very vocal about his politics and was very critical of the United States and other Western powers who were oppressing, undergoing various forms of oppression. And The photograph I have on the right there is just a photograph of the type of surveillance that he experienced during the Cold War as a result of these forms of resistance. Um, he actually was unable to travel for almost a decade because his passport was revoked in response to his critiques of the United States. Uh, W.E.B. Du Bois is another person whose passport was revoked during this time. And so, even though he experienced these forms of containment and surveillance because of his resistance through his art, he still found really unique ways to protest. Next slide. One of the ways that he protested, even before he was physically unable to leave the country, was through his work. And this is something that I was recently researching through his work in the International Workers' Order. And this was, if you go to the next slide, this was an integrated fraternal order established in 1930, lasting until 1954. Um, and it dissolved as a result of Cold War surveillance. This was a fraternal order that offered a variety of services to working class members, such as health insurance, life insurance, unemployment insurance. And it was largely made up of a working class rank and file membership. But one of the important legacies of the IWO is its support of Black artists, people like Paul Robeson, Kenneth Spencer, Langston Hughes, the jazz artist Laura Duncan, and others who found a home to perform in these spaces hosted by the IWO and use their performance as protest. That's kind of the recurring theme tonight is how do we understand representation, not just as a way to perform violence, but also as a way to resist that violence. And through his membership and work within the IWO, Paul Robeson used the stage to resist. Next slide. One of the ways that he did this was through in 1941, a sort of pageant that the IWO put on. And within this pageant, there was a particular portion called The Negro in American Life. And this was basically tracing African American contributions across US history, but also being critical of that. For instance, they sang, Laura Duncan, who I mentioned earlier, sang the song Strange Fruit, which is known for its critique of lynching. And so this was a moment where Robeson and other Black artists were, through the support of the IWO, using the stage as a site of resistance. They were resisting those distorted histories that would either erase African Americans altogether or render them comedic footnotes to our history. And so this is an example of the ways that Paul Robeson and other artists were artist activists. Next slide. And this is just another example of some of the performances that he did within the IWO, where he was critical, particularly during World War II, of the United States projecting these democratic ideals, but at the same time, turning a blind eye to racism within its own borders. So kind of the double V campaign, if you will. Next slide. And he particularly did this by singing ballads like Ballad for Americans, which, as you can see in some of the lyrics on the right, was a critique of the United States, but also a demand for inclusion within the United States. As you can see in that last verse, right? For I have always believed it, and I believe it now, and now you know who I am. Who are you? America, America. And so in those lyrics, he was again insisting upon an inclusion within the United States even as he was critiquing it. Next slide. So that's just a little bit of, I know it's not exactly Jacksonville related, but it's just a little bit of what I've been researching recently that showcases the ways that African Americans have used different creative platforms to resist these very damaging histories. But how can we reckon with the contested past as a way to heal, right? I know that the theme of the series is healing, excuse me. Next slide. So one of the things, of course, as probably you all are already doing, right, as members of the Jacksonville Urban League already, is to take actionable steps to support Black communities, especially in the spirit of Juneteenth coming up, and specifically its call to agitate, participating and supporting local initiatives that not just support Black communities overall, but particularly preserve Black history. Attending meetings sponsored by local organizations like the Jacksonville Community Action Committee or the Northside Coalition of Jacksonville, and even through the support of Black business, right? Through um, the Melanin Market, for instance, really showcases Black businesses in the area. Next slide. One way that we here at UNF are trying to, in the present moment, help preserve local Black history, is through a collaboration that we have with the Okefenokee Heritage Center and the Black Heritage Committee in Waycross, Georgia. And this is an ongoing, several years in the making project that is meant to physically restore and document the history of a historically Black cemetery in Waycross, Georgia. And this is just a screenshot of our website and some of the work that we've been doing to help really center and hold space for Black histories in the Waycross, Georgia area. Next slide. We've done this by bringing students up to the Heritage Center to digitize death certificates and help them make these documents accessible to the community. We've done this by bringing on students to do archival research. And these are just some of my students on the top right corner who have really helped a lot and contributed to some of this research. We've also created a virtual cemetery by using ground penetrating radar equipment to actually map out both marked and unmarked graves. Next slide. But one of the major ways that we have been trying to center Black voices and preserve local Black history in Waycross is by conducting oral histories. And this is just one example of our first oral history that we conducted with the McNeil Miller family. Um, Mrs. Mrs. Nettie Marie McNeil Miller and her daughter, Marty Miller, who are pictured here. And really centering Black family history as an archive, right? That often these histories are left out of, the more traditional archives that we may think of, but their family histories are an archive themselves, very important archives. And so this project that we're doing, again, in collaboration with our community partners, is trying to honor these histories and honor these family legacies. Next slide. And so a couple of other things that we all in Jacksonville can do to support local Black communities is, of course, attending Juneteenth celebrations. So I just have a couple of upcoming Juneteenth events happening through the Melanin Market and at the Ritz Theater. Next slide. We can also do it by uh, either supporting or becoming a part of spaces that honor local Black history. There is the Ashe Institute that my friend and colleague, Dr. Jonathan Grant, here in the sociology department, has created this year. That is sort of a public Black history class that he offers at Cafe Resistance. So that's every first and third Saturday. So I encourage you all to check that out if you don't know about that. And of course, the James Weldon Johnson branch of ASALH. We have president here, Mrs. Gillis. Thank you again for joining us. Um, and this is a really important local chapter of ASALH that is, making great efforts to honor Black history um, through, for instance, Literary Voice in Sing Park. Next slide. You can also take part in events hosted by nonprofit organizations like 90 Forward, who, as I mentioned before, was one of the partners of this exhibit that I showed about lynching in Jacksonville. So they hold different events, such as soil ceremonies. They had a soil ceremony back in September to honor the victims of lynching here in Jacksonville. Next slide. As I mentioned before, Literary Voice and Sing Part has been having a lot of different events. And this is a way to not only celebrate the Johnson brothers and their legacy, but also to really come together and support historically Black neighborhoods like La Villa. Next slide. Or to think about environmental justice efforts put on by, for instance, Earth's Farmers Market in the Moncrief area. And this is a really important part of Eartha White's legacy here in Jacksonville, and they do incredible work in the community around urban farming and other kind of regenerative processes. Next slide. So thank you. I know that was a little bit of a fast run through there, but I just wanted for us to think about this history of contested memory, not just nationwide, but locally here in Jacksonville, and the ways that we can still honor that legacy by the actions that we take today. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Let's open it up for questions. We have, I think, two great historians here. We have President Hazel Gillis, and also I see Dan Jenkins is here as well, historian. So any comments?
Yes,
Questions?
this is
Go
Hazel
ahead.
Gillis. I think I'll answer before my member Dion Jenkins speaks. But my question is to you. First of all, thank you so much for the excellent presentation. I would like to say that on one of your slides where you mentioned attending meetings, would you please add a solid to that slide?
Oh, yes, of course. I meant when I showed the ASALH image, I meant
I mean,
to.
before that, there was another one where you
Oh,
mentioned other organizations and attending meetings. If
yes.
you'll add us to that slide. And the question I have for you, are you presenting this at the Asala conference or is there something else you're presenting?
No, a few colleagues and we had put together a kind of Black women storytelling
Oh, great.
panel. And that's where I'll be talking more about, again, hopefully if it's accepted, talking more about the uh, sort of the Black women's labor within the Red Hill Cemetery project, particularly focusing on people like Marty Miller, who I mentioned, and her mother, and a lot of the work that they've been doing.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Gillis.
Mr. Jenkins, did you have a comment? I look like you had gone off mute.
Yes. Yeah. How are you doing, Dr. Bevel? Thank you so much for being here. Wonderful presentation.
Thank
Um,
you.
when you were talking about emancipation celebrations, I wanted to sort of focus in specifically on Juneteenth because it seems like there's so many emancipation celebrations, but Juneteenth has been the one that sort of taken national significance. Can you kind of explain why Juneteenth kind of catapulted to national significance versus the other ones?
Yes, well, I would, that's a great question. Thank you so much.
Okay.
I would say that really as we move into the 20th century, moving towards the mid 20th century, the variety of emancipation celebrations that we saw in the decades prior to that really kind of started to diminish a bit in how widespread they were. And Juneteenth really kind of became this symbol of emancipation celebrations. And in some ways, it sometimes, there's often not, there's not an awareness of other sorts of celebrations like May 20th, right? Here in
Yeah.
Jacksonville in Florida, we celebrate May 20th as kind of the Florida version of Juneteenth, if you will. And so I think that there are still ways at the local and regional level that Juneteenth isn't the only celebration, but I think kind of nationwide, or at least within our kind of national conversation about Black history, and I guess now that that has become a holiday that has caused some of that, but it has sort of become this umbrella for a variety of emancipation celebrations that we no longer really talk about. So I think
Okay.
it's a combination of it becoming a holiday as well as some of the changes that we see in the 40s and 50s, particularly following World War II, and some of the disillusionment that African Americans were um, experiencing. Um, particularly people like our very own A. Philip Randolph, who
Hmm.
led the March on Washington movement in the 40s. And, it was because of Randolph that we got, the military desegregated and the defense industries opened up to African Americans. And I think people like Randolph were becoming more and more disillusioned with the US and sort of African Americans' place in that. Um, and so I think we're kind of entering a new moment within the Black freedom struggle, and of course, kind of entering the modern civil rights movement in the post World War II period. So I think there's just these larger shifts that are happening nationwide, and emancipation celebrations are kind of following those shifts.
Okay. Cool. And then to kind of follow up, because I mean, you mentioned 20th of May. So in your research, did you find a lot of sort of accounts of like May 20th celebrations here in Jacksonville
I
area?
have found several in the archives, but there were much more Juneteenth celebrations,
Which
I
one?
would say.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. Okay.
Again, I mean, this is not an exhaustive uh, archival uh, dig here, but just
Yeah.
from what I have researched on that, um,
Okay.
there have been a few, yes.
Cool. Cool. Thank you.
I had a comment and a question. Um, I was just great presentation, by the way. I've seen a lot of presentations on Black history and studied history in college.
Oh,
Uh,
great.
I actually started out as a astrophysics major, but quickly decided it was better to go over to history. But first of all, the observation on how, because it's so in front of us now, how people uh, demonstrated in a way that they could do that without uh, getting, in addition to losing their passport, being kicked out of the country, like Robeson, what he was doing in his recordings and his appearances, very impressive. And that's a thread that I hadn't thought of. And obviously, I'm not a Black historian, and I don't know enough about it. I look forward to learning more and more from folks like you on this discussion. But the other thing I was thinking about is we had such actually two things. One is we had great success. I wouldn't say great, but significant success in the bicentennial, where we got Black History Month. We got the bicentennial group came together, uh, and I'm just wondering, you is much going on now for the 250th to kind of use it as a means of reminding people of history.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know if many people are working as vigorously as they did for the bicentennial to renew Black history through the 250th?
Oh yes, that I mean, like I mentioned, Asala is, really kind of in many ways taking the lead on that, and really kind of centering critiques of that this current year in their upcoming conference in September in Norfolk, Virginia. Um, and I see that here locally. The Ashe Institute that I mentioned before, um, Dr. Grant, that's kind of part of the framework as well, a little bit, and kind of critiquing how we are not just understanding Black history, but the urgency in holding on to that and making space for educating the public about Black history at a time when it's under attack. Um, and then here at UNF, we've been having a lot of different 250th events that are in some ways critical of the United States and its histories of racial violence. So I mean, I am seeing that. I mean, I think that perhaps on a kind of national level, the coverage is more of the kind of more sanitized celebrations that we're seeing
Mhm.
coming out of like DC. But I think there's a lot of efforts at the local level to uh, disrupt that narrative and to be critical of of our nation's history and what steps we need to take moving forward.
You mean to be more objective and indicate the truth about our history?
Well, really to understand history as something that has been interpreted. And so
Right.
that's,
Okay.
I tell my students all the time that, you know, there are so many different interpretations of the past, and it's really about returning to the evidence that you have and supporting whatever argument you're making through that evidence. Um, and, to ultimately be critical of the evidence, to not take things at face value, um, but to understand that there's bias in
Hmm.
so much of the historical documents and archival material that we encounter. So I would say more so subjective, that it's and that's why we have these
I
different
see.
versions, is because people have interpreted the past in different ways.
To use a bad word in this state, to be deconstructive,
Uh,
really take it apart and
mhm.
and look at the different biases. And is that what you're saying?
Yes, yes. So for instance, when I first start some of my history classes, I have us the class look at two different articles about newspaper articles about lynching, one that's celebrating it and one that's condemning it. And on the surface, you may look at both and say, "Oh, well, it's historical documents. This is the evidence." But to really think about, okay, why was a particular newspaper presenting this position on lynching? Who was its readership? Why was the newspaper even created in the first place? So to ask these different questions about the evidence, that helps us have a more complicated understanding of it. So
Right.
it's really about critical thinking. That's
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
That's great.
That's
Yeah.
the main message. That's why I told my class earlier today. I was like, critical thinking. That's the main takeaway of the class. But yeah, I mean, thinking about how we as historians um, can instill that critical thinking in our students, um, particularly at a time when there's an absence of critical thinking in some
Yeah,
spheres. Yeah.
absolutely. The last comment is, to me, that those lyrics that you had from Robeson,
Yeah.
where he said basically, "I'm an American, we're all Americans," and to me, it underscores the value of the contributions of the Black uh, people from our founding, who
Hmm.
just continued to bear, to fight, to keep going in any way they could. And it's such a great um, example of what an American should be, despite all the terrible things that were done and are continuing to be done uh,
Hmm.
to not only Black people, but other, people in our society. The example that these gentlemen and women and young people like Hearst demonstrated to us. It's just inspiring.
It is. It's very inspiring, and again to see the level of perseverance. I mean, Paul Robeson, even when he was unable to leave the country, he found really creative ways to still protest. The image I showed of him
Exactly. Yeah.
with the immigration sign, that was him on the US Canadian border, where during the 50s, he put on several, they were called Peace Arch concerts, where he literally like stood on the border of Canada and performed.
Mm.
Um, and through his performances, talked about decolonization and protests in the United States. Um, so even though he was unable to cross the border, he still found creative ways
Mhm.
to protest. Or in 1955, during the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, um, which uh, brought together leaders of newly independent African and Asian nations for the first time. He wanted to go, but he was unable to go because he didn't have his passport. So instead, as scholars like Shanna Redmond have argued, um, he sent a recording of himself singing Old Man River, and also giving a speech in support of decolonization. He sent that recording to the conference and they played it at
Mm.
the conference, even though he was unable to actually be there physically. So, I mean, just the creativity that he had, I was like, wow, he was blacklisted and just faced all sorts of persecution. But he still persevered and still found ways to protest.
Very impressive. I think Mr. Jenkins has his hand up.
Yeah, how you doing? This will be my last question, but I know you earlier in your presentation you mentioned how, you know, Black studies and, African American history, whether it's K through 12 curriculum or at the higher education level, is kind of being, dismantled. I wanted to kind of get your thoughts. Like, what do you think is going to take for us to um, maybe reinvigorate like a younger generation to kind of get engaged with Black history and preserve, this memory and stuff like that? Because I think the young generation is going to be important in this, you know.
Yeah, I agree that, I think, and that's something that I try to emphasize, particularly when I teach like the civil rights movement, is the power of youth, not just here in Jacksonville, but also nationwide. And I think as an educator here at UNF, I do see that. I do see, students who are involved in SDS, Students for Democratic Society, or involved in the Black Student Union here, despite the kind of attacks on DEI officially here at the university, they're still finding ways to not just protest here on campus, but join forces with various organizations to protest, police brutality and other forms of injustice in the larger community. So I do think that, that is still inspiring and empowering to see students, still be involved in those sorts of organizations. Um, I think that social media is another platform that has been helpful in organizing, particularly among youth. Um, so, I think that there is some inspiration in the method of organizing that I think is different than past generations. And I think it's just, that Black communities themselves have to take it upon themselves to do this work. Churches. I know that I go to Bethel Church, and they've been talking about restarting a school for kids so that they can learn Black history. The Ashe Institute, Asala, right? That these are spaces that are still doing the work and still trying to educate the public about Black history. So I think it's really just local communities taking it upon themselves to do this, because the state isn't not anytime soon, um, isn't going to change their stance on this. And so it's really about empowering ourselves to create these spaces.
And I
Okay.
see that President Gillis had had a hand up.
Yes, I just want to mention two things. Our branch, we actually have a freedom school that we run. It will start up again in October, where we teach Black history. Also, I'm part of the Duval County Public Schools African American Task Force. We try to make sure that the classes are taught in the schools. Duval County is a little different from some of the other counties. Uh, we will actually be taking students to St. Augustine next week as part of the Summer Writing Institute. So we're trying our best to continue to teach Black history, and I'm fortunate that April Slade, the director of K through 12, is pushing that we teach Black history in Duval County.
Yes, yes, I've met her once. Yes, yes. Thank you for that, President Gillis. And yeah, I mean, this is an example of the important work that's already being done here in Jacksonville. So I think it's about continuing to support the work that is being done, and getting the word out.
Um, and also, I did want to recognize Jocelyn Turner, the president of our guild, who has just made a comment in our chat. And she says, let me know when you want.
No, no, I said we also need to do, good evening. I said we also need to do a mass campaign to teach what DEI really means and
Yeah,
who benefits.
absolutely.
Yes, that,
Yeah.
yes,
Mhm.
yeah.
Sorry, I'm eating dinner, so I didn't want you all
DEI,
to.
critical race theory, intersectionality, all of those. I think, yeah, there definitely is a misunderstanding of what all of those terms mean. And yeah.
All right. Well, any other questions before we close? Well, I want to thank you, Professor Bevel. It's just been great to hear this, and it not only uh, opened some doors, but has identified some other doors that we can open at the Jacksonville Urban League, and just get more information about the topic and the players like yourself, uh, and Ms. Gillis and Mr. Jenkins and others. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Again, I really appreciate you all's patience tonight, and it was really great to be in conversation with you all. And thank you for the wonderful work that you all are doing.
Oh, well, it's through the blessings of people like Jocelyn Turner, Anna Russell, who's with us here, our intern,
Wow.
and others. So, you know, and all those at the Urban League, our director and CEO, president, Richard Danford, and others. So, well, thank you, everyone. Have a great evening, and I look forward to your coming back after the conference and sharing some of the insights that you get from that.
Okay,
Thank you.
yes, that would be great.
All right, thank you.
Thank you so much.
You have a good one. Bye,
Thank you
everyone.
so much.
Thank you.